Hello, today we will be talking about extended double bass techniques and cool sound effects like what is currently playing. The techniques talked about in this video can be applied to all stringed instruments, but more specifically violin, viola, cello, and western bowed stringed instruments. What is an extended technique, you may be asking? An extended technique is basically a way of producing sound that would be considered not common practice, non-traditional, or unconventional. I will also be explaining these techniques and talking about what does and doesn't work so well, in my opinion. For all of you composers out there, do not abuse these. Please consult a stringed instrumentalist. I will also not be talking about how these things are notated, partly because I don't know how everything is notated, and in my experience, composers usually have a legend to guide performers. I hope, at the very least, I can show or teach you one new thing today, and I hope to have subtitles in other languages. Now, let's begin. First, I will demonstrate and then talk about how I did the particular technique or sound effect. Feel free to pause or slow down the video in the video settings if anything seems unclear. Col Lengo, not Col Lengo. Please forgive my mispronunciation. It basically means with the stick of the bow. First, let's talk about the bow hold. I find it easiest to hold the bow in an overhand grip, something similar to this. I feel more in control, and the motion that I use, which is this sort of a motion, just feels more natural to me, as opposed to a German bow hold and this sort of a motion. The next thing I can also do in an overhand grip is move my hand higher up on the stick, which can help me play more precisely, sometimes, in some cases, not always. In a German bow hold, it can also be quite awkward to play the E string, no matter how you position your arm. And I also have more bow to deal with. But the one big advantage to a German bow hold, if you're a German bow player, of course, is switching back and forth between Col Lengo and arco. If you play passages that alternate quickly, it's much more ideal. The next thing I want to mention, which is really important, is while playing Col Lengo, it's very important that you are careful with your bow, because if you're not, you can cause irreparable damage. I think if you just use a little bit of common sense, you'll be fine. Now, let's discuss execution. Generally speaking, you're going to want to use the upper third of the bow, and I suggest using whichever grip feels more comfortable to you. You should start by playing something slow and quietly, like a scale, just so you get a feel for the wood of the bow on the string, and so you don't cause any damage. Then you can gradually increase speed and dynamics accordingly as you start to get more comfortable. Then, working on the ricochet, which can be more challenging, but that's a part of the fun. I suggest strokes of 2, 3, 4, and however many you want to go up to develop a feel for the bow bouncing on the string. And it's important not to fight the bow. You just really have to let the bow work for you and not the other way around. You may have noticed that each time I play Col Lengo, there are two distinct pitches that can be heard. The first pitch is the sound of the open string or stop note that we were playing. There's a second pitch that can be heard. What is that second pitch, you may be wondering? The second pitch is the sound of the bow, and wherever it lies. So, the closer to the bridge, the higher the pitch will be, and the opposite is true. So, the further away from the bridge and closer to the nut, the lower the pitch will be. We can isolate this sound and get it to speak more clearly if we mute the string with our entire left hand. I say entire hand because if we mute the string with 1 or even 2 fingers, we can potentially play harmonics, which is not the sound we're trying to get. I also don't really apply much pressure, just enough pressure to mute the string, because the more pressure that I apply, the closer the string gets to the fingerboard, and I run the risk of potentially hitting the fingerboard along with the string, which is just extra unnecessary noise and not what we're trying to do. We can also mute 2 strings at the same time and play in between the 2 strings to get some really cool sound effects. Now there's one more thing I want to mention for now. You can also bow with the stick the same way you bow with hairs on the bow. However, this does not really produce much sound. It's quite wispy and a very unique sound. You may want to experiment with some combination of bow and stick to get more sound. Now, I'll play some of these things to demonstrate them. You may be asking yourself, why does flipped or inverted playing work? It just doesn't make any sense. Well, it's as if we flip the bass without actually having to flip it. So if we literally flipped our instrument, then first position would be up here. The octave harmonic would be around here, and it's the one note that stays exactly the same. And the reason for this is because you can only cut the string in half at one point. And knowing where the octave harmonic is, we can figure out what thumb position is and where that starts. Then all the super high harmonics that we would expect to find up here can also be found down here. Now I will play a G major scale and an E major scale to demonstrate. Please bear with me. I don't practice like this. I know it's hard to believe, but it's just not something I normally do. It's going to be all kinds of out of tune, but that's part of the fun. Okay. In terms of execution, you're going to want to put your bow closer to the nut, similar to how we bow closer to the bridge when we play higher up in thumb position. You should also experiment with different bow grips. I hold my bow in a different grip because traditional bow grips can be quite awkward and really don't work so well when playing closer to the scroll. There's even more we can do with Col Lengo with reverse playing, and because things are flipped, you will not be able to achieve the same tone you would be to otherwise, because the bass is not designed to be played that way, so the tone you will get will always be thinner and much more nasally. And one last thing, things may not be the most intuitive, so be patient. The first thing we need to do is find a bow grip that works for us. The next big challenge is keeping our bow all along the same plane without having it drift too much one way or another. I really find that looking down at my bow helps immensely. The really cool thing about this technique is that it allows us to play double stops and harmonics that we would only ever be able to play pizzicato otherwise. Playing with toilet paper requires some experimentation, to say the least, and what I do may not necessarily work for you, but let me tell you what I do in any case. So I keep my thumb and index finger in fairly independent positions, and they're basically doing what they would normally do. I keep the rest of my fingers sandwiched in the center hole of the toilet paper, and I apply more pressure than I normally would, because the surface area of toilet paper is much greater than the surface area of my fingers, and for that reason you will not get as clear of a tone. However, you can play harmonics fairly clearly because all you really need to do is lightly touch the string, which you can do with toilet paper. You just really need to find what works for you, and as long as you're not playing with brown toilet paper, you should be fine. Hello. Good to see you again. Alright, so first thing is first. If you have a mute on, take the mute off. If you leave the mute on, it will mute the tailpiece and prevent the good vibes from flowing through. Now, we're going to be placing our bow towards the top of the tailpiece and applying pressure using arm weight. It is important that you keep a consistent pressure and bow speed to get an even tone. A slower bow speed is preferred. And if it helps, you may want to put both of your hands on opposite ends of the bow, so your left hand over here, and pressing evenly on both sides to get a better idea of the amount of pressure that is needed. And lastly, if you play with too much or too little rosin, this will make this more challenging. Combination tones. I'm pretty sure that's what this is called. I think this is also one of the easier sound effects because all you really have to do is play out of tune, but in a certain way, of course. To accomplish this, you are going to need to play two notes, one drone-like note, preferably an open string, and a note which is slightly sharper or flatter than the pitch that is consistent. Sliding in and out of the pitch creates another tone, the combination tone, which vibrates significantly slower. Now we're going to look at the strings to see how they are moving. All you need to do is find a place on your bass where you can rub and roll the stick of your bow against the hairs. Make sure your bow is relatively loose and does not have too much rosin on it. need to mute the string or strings we are playing with our entire hand, because if we do not, we run the risk of potentially playing harmonics, similar to how we did in Col Lengo. We also don't really need to apply much pressure, just enough pressure to keep the strings muted is all that is needed. I say mostly non-pitched because there's obviously still the pitch of wherever our pinky or whatever our last finger lies, but the wispiness from the bow we get really dominates the sound, and it's not sounding, the pitch that we're playing isn't really sounding. Also, for our right hand, we are not going to want to apply too much pressure. If we apply too much pressure, then we start to get harmonics. And similar for our left hand, if we apply too much pressure, then we start to get the stop notes, which is not what we want. We want a wispy, just a nice wispy sound. In terms of bowing, we can obviously bow horizontally, we can bow vertically, bow wherever you want really. You can also bow in some circular patterns, and maybe you want to bow in a triangle or a decagon or a hectagon. Really, it doesn't matter, any combination works. And we can also get some pretty cool glissando-like sounds and just explore, and I'm sure you'll find some great things. So there are two things we can do to bend harmonics. The first thing we can do is we can physically shake our instrument from side to side. This really isn't bending the pitch, however, this is sending the sound in whichever direction, and we get a similar effect. The second thing we can do is we can physically bend the string below the bridge or above the nut in the headstock. I find it easier to bend the string below the bridge because I have more string to deal with, as opposed to above the headstock. My A and D string are really the only two strings I can bend. My E and G string I cannot bend because they're too close to the headstock. I think also the best thing to do is a combination of shaking your instrument and bending the strings. You probably noticed that I didn't focus on two very big things in the world of extended techniques. I didn't really talk much about percussive things in terms of hitting the bass. The reason why I didn't talk about this is because I don't spend much time practicing my bass percussively. And the next big thing I didn't really spend much time talking about is harmonics. And the reason for this is because there's so much to talk about, literally so much to talk about when it comes to playing harmonics. So in the future, I plan on making a 3-part video series, first on harmonics, just natural harmonics, the overtone series, and the second video being about false harmonics, and the third about other harmonic techniques that aren't reutilized very often. Things like what's about to play. I know there are more extended techniques out there, and maybe in the future I will make a video about that. But for now, I hope you have a better idea of what the bass and other Western bowed stringed instruments are capable of. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you begin to explore things that sound new to you, because this really is just the tip of the iceberg.